อเป็นพิธีเนาะเดี๋ยวก็ Okay, then we will start, and a few of them might follow or join us later on. I will thank you everyone again here for joining us and spending time here in this evening. I will give a brief. I mean, I have a full page, but I will just briefly introduce Professor Bart Lootsma. He's a historian, critic, and a curator in the field of architecture, design, and visual art. Right? He's a professor of architectural theory and the head of Department of Architectural History and Theory at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. And also before that, he was a guest professor and head of scientific research, also in other European institutes and schools. And he held numerous seminars and lectures in different academies in the Arts and Architecture Academy in the Netherlands, where he used to work and teach in the Berlake for a while. Also, he was a member of several government and semi-government committees in different countries. And his recent project, which he co-produced with in the Montenegro Pavilion this year, Venice Biennale. He's now working on it, and also he's been widely published or write numerous books and magazines, and his famous one, many of us is familiar with, is the Super Dutch. He's the one who wrote that. And his forthcoming book is the Reality Bite, which will be both in German and English by Berghauser, I think so, and also many other books. So a long list. So, and yeah, so it's an honor to have Professor Bart Lootsma today, this evening with us. And so without further ado, so please welcome Professor Bart Lootsma.
Thank you, Kay. So thank you very much for having me here. Indeed, I'm very happy to be here. I happen to have had Thai students at the Berlage Institute, Peter Pung Chow Kool, among others, and now I have a Thai collaborator. So now that I was invited to Kuala Lumpur, I thought it would be a good idea to try to make the most out of that, and hopefully we can establish a somewhat longer collaboration. I mean, for us, let's say, Asia has much more of a future than Europe at the moment, and there are all kinds of issues that you have more experience in, the speed of growth, the growth of the cities, etc., that we would be very interested in. But also, we have seen that in the last couple of years, increasingly Thai architecture is appreciated internationally with architectural review awards, emerging architecture, etc. So we have quite some interest in Thai architecture. Nok, my collaborator, studied here and then took her PhD in Italy, and is now with us. And I think it's time to have some more of an exchange. So let's see. Oops, this is a bit loud. This is because we were just talking about it. We have our websites on which we podcast all our lectures. So and then we have this intro. So very briefly about who we are. I come from nowadays, the last 10 years I've been at the University of Innsbruck. That's in Austria. It's in the mountains, as you will see later. And we have this office of ours in which every collaborator has his own box, and we can rearrange them. And we do that once or twice a year, so that you'll always get different relationships between the people. As you can see, the building is for European standards not very old. It's from the 1970s, and it's outside of the city. So here you can see it in the evening, how people would be working there. So this is my partner, Katrina Weinberger, with whom I also curate the exhibition at the Biennale that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about later on. So what do we do? Architectural theory, we have 3 websites, all in English and in German. This is the main website on which there's also the news. So we're among these 50 best architecture schools in Europe this year. But we also have Architectural Theory TV, on which all the lectures that we do are podcasted. We also do a kind of documentary movies, and of course all the symposia, conferences you can find there. There's quite some content in English, and it's basically also on our Vimeo channel. And then we have another website that produces all the texts that we produce. So that is the text that we publish. We also publish on our own website. Then we have our research. We have some research projects, very different ones, but you can explore that yourself. The dissertations, the studios, because that is something that we do. We teach architectural theory in studios, like a design studio. So that also means that we are working on a kind of project. And basically, I'm going to give you a few introduction, more or less, in this lecture of 3 of those studios that share a certain theme or certain themes. So therefore this lecture is called Electrification Takes Command. That was also the name of a studio we did last year, also with NOC. And you can imagine this was inspired by Mechanization Takes Command, the book by Siegfried Gideon, in which Siegfried Gideon shows how all kind of parts of buildings and even chairs and etc., in the course of time were mechanized. And I don't know if you've read the book, it's a fascinating book still. It's from, I think, 1948, so it's, in a way you could say it's old, but it's still very fascinating. Even things that you would never imagine reading about, like the history of the lock, is really fascinating. So now the question is not so much if that was the issue, let's say, in the 20th century, and largely also in the first half of the 20th century, how is architecture influenced by mechanization? Then at a certain point you have to ask yourself, well, what happens then with the electrification of architecture? Well, that's maybe, we mean, of course, the influence of the computer, notably, and lately we realize more and more that there are also other aspects that change our relationship to our environment, which is also largely medication, pills, hormones, etc. I will not talk too much about that today, a little bit, but basically, to start with, the idea was when you look at the way how technology is, let's say, appreciated culturally these days, I would say Zaha Hadid architecture represents the kind of state of the art. So it is an architecture that has been designed with the latest software on a computer that is largely also made or designed with the idea that it could be produced by robots. And the intriguing thing is that it becomes a kind of, at least in Zaha Hadid's work, it becomes a kind of all-encompassing environment in which we live in this style that Patrick Schumacher has defined as the style of parametricism. Patrick was a professor with us until 2 years ago in Innsbruck, but he is now way too successful, so he is not with us anymore. But basically the idea is that you have this kind of environment that is completely defined by this designing with the computer and building with the computer, and that basically encompasses everything from scent candles to urbanism. And basically the idea, as in this show for Chanel by Zaha Hadid, the idea is that we all come out as a kind of new parametrically designed people. Now, I don't think that is really the case. Here you see a hotel room by Zaha Hadid for Dubai. There you see exactly what happens. So on the one hand you your parametric hotel room, but as soon as you look out of the window, you see a completely other world. So the question is if this is really where, let's say, computerization brings us in architecture. And that brings us to a movie like Her by Spike Jonze from 2013, where Theodore gets this new software with the voice of Scarlett Johansson, and it's the most advanced kind of stuff. It plays, I think, in 2000. So there is not really that spectacular a jump in what architecture looks like between today and 2020, maybe. In this case, Spike Jonze was advised by Liz Diller from Diller and Scofidio, and there are some more skyscrapers in Los Angeles, but basically, and he wears a different kind of pants that are a bit higher up than is fashionable these days, but that is those are about the changes, and the software, the miniaturization of this digital assistant, it gets so small that it disappears. So that is also the stance, that's the other position these days about architecture and technology. That's the sense that Rem Koolhaas took at the Venice Biennale in 2014, the elements of architecture, and indeed that was very much inspired on Gideon. So you see all how computerizations changes all the parts, the elements of architecture. So here you see, for example, how from the fire, you should just see that on the left here, next to the backpack, how that is under the influence of technical innovation that is developed in all kind of different things, from a television, a computer, to a barbecue that is more archaic than it used to be, etc., etc. And also here the idea is that, well, basically these parts become, all building parts become more intelligent, says Rem Koolhaas. They learn from our behavior, and basically that this thermostat by Nest sums that idea up. So basically hardly visible, or maybe even invisible at a certain point, you have this kind of element that betrays that your building has become intelligent. So that's a very different stance. Another aspect about of technology is, of course, robotics. So it is really interesting to see at Bartlett in London, and I was an external examiner there the last couple of years. It was very interesting to see how students learn to deal with robots, how to program them so that they can make certain things. It is incredibly interesting to see how they also build the tools for these robots. So they come there for 1 year, and they completely from scratch learned to work with the software, to work with the robots, and build these tools for the robots that then can do all these different things. So you see that every team of students has a different technology. In this case, the elements are still quite small, but the idea is basically that these chairs, as they stand here, are completely developed with different techniques that these robots can handle. And also in the back there, these kind of sculptures or small towers are all based on different techniques that these robots can deal with. On the other hand, again, the Bartlett, 95% Asian students these days, which is for Europeans a kind of strange idea. On the other hand, when you then see then what happens in Asia, in this case in China, in terms of 3D printing, you see this. So basically, on one hand, more advanced. Already buildings are 3D printed in Asia. On the other hand, the way they look is much more conservative, or even very conservative in comparison to the way the students learn to design at the Bartlett. So also here you see an incredible discrepancy between the state of the art of technology and the desires architects have to deal with that, and the reality. The reality is at the same time more conservative and much more advanced. And I think at this moment the highest building that is built in 3D printing is now 4 stories, if I'm correct, but it could already be different. So that is so you could focus like Siegfried Gideon, on the way technology has an impact on architecture, also how it produces a new aesthetics, etc., etc. The way Gideon did it, but maybe that is not the way to go. And maybe it is about something else, really. So what has changed immensely, of course, is the way how our body relates to our environment, or how even our body itself has changed. So in that sense, maybe it is not so much about the style that is being developed, as Patrick Schumacher thinks, but it is maybe about something completely different. And it's also the cultural appearance in a completely different terrain than we expect as we are educated in modern architecture still. So if we go look at the relationship between the body and architecture, basically most of our thoughts are still based on Leonardo da Vinci, or at least the way how they find their way in architecture, the Vitruvian Man. So that means we see this man that is inscribed in a square and a circle. It is a man, he is the center of this universe somehow. He controls this universe if we look at Renaissance architecture. But at the same time, we're living, of course, in very different times, and this model is not so desirable anymore. So on the one hand, you see that, of course, there is a much stronger feminist tendency, as is, for example, here expressed in this book by Rosi Berardotti, in which it's, of course, strange that it is a man who dominates, is at the center of the world, and a man who dominates this world, whereas maybe there are other genders that are equally interesting or appropriate to be mentioned. So that is one aspect. In that sense, we enter finally a kind of post-humanist epoch. Even modernist architecture starts from this geometrical idea about the body and about industrial production. We have already seen in the books by Beatrice Colomina that, of course, how she analyzes the way modern architects like Loos and Le Corbusier deal with issues of gender in architecture. And these books are quite critical about that, and first kind of manifest that in a kind of critical way. When we look at the more recent developments in feminism, these kind of old antipodes are dissolving. We see a book like A Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway, for example, in which the fact that we are all becoming cyborgs in some way, I think even in this audience there's hardly anyone who is not a cyborg, suddenly offers also opportunities to deal with the gender issue very differently, and that becomes very much a construct. And if we go further to this book, the book on the right, Pornotopia by Beatrice Preciado, that is taken one step further. It is a very interesting book that shows the influence of, among others, and largely Playboy magazine on modern architecture. And that influence, she convincingly explains, is much bigger than we thought. So suddenly, from a critical standpoint about gender and a more conservative idea about the body and architecture, we have moved to a situation where we know that architecture also constructs this body. Now, on the one hand, that is about the body. On the other hand, we also develop, at least in the West, a different attitudes towards our relationship to nature. That is also largely defined by Deleuze and Guattari still. On the one hand, their writings on ecology, in Guattari's The Three Ecologies, in which, let's say, our relationship with nature is much more complex than it used to be. Man is a part of that. It's not someone who stands outside of it, as it was the case in the Renaissance. And let's say our relationship, this ecology, is not something that is just a physical phenomenon, but it's also defined by stories, by desires, etc. So at best, maybe we can explain that in this way. On the left, you see the cover of Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus in the English translation. And it has on its cover an image by Fritz Kahn from the 1930s, in which man is largely depicted as a machine. But this machine is not a machine in the sense of the modern movement. It's a very different machine. It is a machine that connects to other machines, but that does not just mechanically connect. It also connects by language, by feelings, by associations, etc. So it is a much more complex form of a machine. This is another image by Fritz Kahn, also from the 1930s. Of course, we don't function this way, but it shows how observations are transformed in our brain in a certain way, how you can see that in a machinic way, and how basically we have developed a different relationship to our environment that also incorporates speech. So in this case, we can think of everything in the sense of machines, also in terms of cycles and chains of reactions, but they are not the kind of rational machines anymore of the modern movement, as it is in this very strange image. So we develop a different relationship to our body, and between our body and our environment, between our body and architecture, and between our body and nature, and between architecture and nature. And I'm going to show you three basically of the kind of summaries of projects that we've been doing with our students in Innsbruck. And one is about the Viennese avant-garde in the 1960s and 70s. Then I'm going to show you very briefly a preview of the project that we're doing for the Biennale at the moment. And the third one is about Innsbruck and how the relationship to nature and to the mountains has largely changed because of leisure in Innsbruck. But to